So that's the history of left wing and right wing. That's where the word left wing and right wing comes, and that's
3% of the population owned 30% of the land and practically paid no tax.
poor people, the commons, they had to spend about 90% of their income on food.
3% of the population held two-thirds of the vote, and the remaining 97% held only one-third of the vote. Hello and welcome to our podcast, Chaotic Chintan, our attempt at understanding the chaos around us. Coming back to you again this week, I'm Vaidehi and this is Pankaj.
Hello.
Hello, Pankaj. So, this week we are going to talk about some commonly thrown around terms, left winger and right winger, that you hear everywhere. So, the current cultural perception, almost globally, is that a left winger is somebody who is who works towards social equality, who is progressive, radical in some thought processes, and also a socialist, which means that they believe in general social growth um, via certain centralized control. Whereas a right winger is somebody who today believes in individual freedoms and at the same time also wants to adhere to social hierarchy and would like to retain that going forward. So that's the perceptions that we have today. But let's discuss more about this today. So it appears that depending upon whoever's in power at that point of time, they turn out to be the force for good, whether they are left or right or in between. But what are these terms, left winger and right wing?
Yeah. Um, okay, so we are getting into a very complicated subject, but it's actually good that we need to address some of these topics, right? Um, so left wing and right wing actually traces its roots back. The terms traces its roots back to the early days of French Revolution. So during the French Revolution, when the National Assembly convened, there were lots of debates that were going on. And people who were sitting on the left were called left wingers, and people who sat on the right of the president were called the right wingers. So that's basically how that had come about. It is from the National Assembly during the French Revolution. Which side you sat, you became that winger.
So in some National Assembly 200 odd years ago, people just happened to sit on one side of the table, on one side of the president's table, and that remains a term to this day to identify what they stood for.
Yes, uh, yes, and
That's very interesting.
it is interesting, and it feels like, well, you may think that it has a very complex origin, and there is a logical explanation for why something is considered left and why something is considered right. It's actually not. It's actually pretty straightforward. So during the French Revolution, um, when people wanted to create their own constitution, write their own constitution, and effectively they were debating whether they want to have a republic or if they should be a constitutional monarch. They just sat on different sides of the aisle, and the people who were arguing for substantial changes to the structure, they were sitting on the left, and people who were interested in a more controlled reform or were arguing for a more structured approach to this were sitting on the right. And effectively, the people on the right were asking to have the king have his power as they had at that time, whereas the left wing at that time was asking for power to be transferred to the people. So that's the main difference. So that's the history of left wing and right wing. That's where the word left wing and right wing comes, and that's to some extent, I think, when you said earlier, um, those definitions are still sort of continuing if you think about it. So people on the left were actually talking about changing the world, talking about social equality and all that. Whereas people on the right were actually talking about how we need to have some structure to, like, there should be some hierarchy. You should have someone who has control over other things, and that's where the right wing comes.
Very interesting. Looks like two people just sitting on the table. I mean, it's amazing how history becomes turns out, right? That people just happen to sit somewhere, and then that becomes a term for all eternity as we know it, at least. All right, Pankaj. So that made sense. That people who just happen to arbitrarily sit on two sides of a president now represent the most important terminology, the most commonly used terminology in politics. Okay. And that you said happened in the National Assembly in the French Revolution. So, what is this National Assembly?
Okay, let's go back a little bit and understand what's Estates General, because that Estates General actually led to National Assembly. And before we understand Estates General, we have to understand what are the estates and get some idea of why there was so much problem to some extent, right? So in France, and this is actually true for a lot of nations in those days or before that era. The power usually sits with the monarch. So the king or the queen usually have the power, and they usually get the power from by the decree of God. So that means you,
Divine proclamation.
yes, you are ruling in the name of God, and because you're ruling in the name of God, you the structure that is reflected in the society. So in France at this time, there were three estates. Estates in this context, estates basically means property, but in this context, it's a representation of property. So the monarch, the kingdom, had three estates: clergy, nobility, and the commons. So clergy is basically church and the associated people. Nobility is the noble bloodline, and commons, people like you and me, and the bourgeois. So, uh,
So, everybody other than the church and
the
those who had
nobility.
noble blood.
Correct. So, clergy, who were about 1% of the population, the church, which was all the priests and all the other people associated with the church, they were about 1% of the population and they controlled 10% of the land. Or sorry, they own 10% of the land. And they also don't have to pay the regular taxes, though they had to make a voluntary donation every 5 years,
Sounds like they didn't have to.
you know.
Yeah.
And to be fair, it's actually not very different from what happens now in a lot of countries. So a lot of countries, clergy actually don't have to pay tax. The next one was nobility, the second estate. And this kind of also gives you an idea of the hierarchy in the system. So the first estate is the clergy, the second estate is the nobility. So the nobility, they were about 2% of the population. So not very significant, but they also owned about 20% of the land. And they were also given a lot of tax exemption. So the rich and the powerful somehow managed to not pay taxes and were close to the king and to the power. The third estate, which is the commons, included everyone else. So that means all the public, even your industrialists. And well, there were no industries those days, but even the merchants who were rich were still
Yeah.
part of.
Large scale trades.
Yes, they were still part of the commons. The kingdom or the king, whenever he wished, he would call for Estates General. So Estates General is your sort of convention where everyone gathers and talks about their problem, and the king may or may not listen to your problems. Well, there was voting. To be fair, the king
Right.
did give rights to vote based on order.
Right. So before we get into too much detail about that, just recapping, there were three estates: the church, the nobility, and the commons. So 3% of the population owned 30% of the land and practically paid no taxes.
Yes.
Wow. But having said that, and then you're talking about estates general
Yes.
and the fact that three estates assembled together, and then you mentioned votes. So what are they voting about?
Estates General, sort of your like parliament, where you convene everyone, you discuss about your problems, and then the executive authority, which is the king in this instance, Louis the 16th, gets to decide what will be implemented or what will not be implemented. And usually there was voting, but the voting was by the order, not by the head. Meaning, if there are five representatives for the clergy and five representatives for the nobility and 100 representatives for the commons, the clergy will get one vote, the nobility will get one vote, and the commons will get one vote.
Right.
So, meaning it doesn't matter how many people you have, you are not represented proportionally. The each estate gets one vote, and because of this, there was major conflict because no matter what, the poor will never be listened to. And when I say poor, mind you, even the rich were sort of poor in this context because they don't really have any power. If you were a middle class, you would still be considered a commons. So they did not have a lot of power to change anything.
Essentially, what you're saying is that the three estates came together to form the estate general at the behest of the king. The king would discuss what the new laws are that are to be voted upon, and then debate would take place, and then they would vote. And 3% of the population held two-thirds of the vote, and the remaining 97% held only one-third of the vote. So, in most circumstances, the 97% would not have a voice.
Correct. And this was obvious, right? It's not like it's a hidden fact. Like everyone knows this just doesn't make sense. And this was voiced out as well. And everyone else agreed that this is not fair. So they gave double representation,
Right.
meaning if the clergy gets two votes and the nobility gets two votes, the commons would get four votes.
Right.
But that is still by the order. So they increase. So one, they increase the representation, meaning the number of people who were representing them were increased, but that did not translate into the increase in voting rights. So the voting rights was exactly the same as before. So the voting was still based on order, not by head, and because of that, um, they get they can still be voted out.
That makes a lot of sense why the Estates General turned into a national assembly, because the third estate decided that they had to have a voice. And interestingly, this is very interesting because in today's circumstance, in a democratic setup, when somebody just decides that we're going to form a forum and we're going to discuss things, it is very normal. But this is a day and age where the king, by divine proclamation, gave edicts on what was allowed and what was not allowed. So the fact that the commoners actually got together without the king's permission, without discussing it with him, without even his presence, as you would realize if you read the entire story, is that um, they just decided by themselves, which means that it is a huge act of rebellion against the king. It's a huge symbol that they have taken matters into their own hands.
To be fair, if you're hungry, nothing else matters, honestly. And that was one of the biggest problem. The prices of uh,
A loaf of
loaf of
bread.
bread was there was hyperinflation. People would spend in the early like 100 years before this, people would spend about half of their money on food.
The commoners, you mean?
Commoners, yes, I mean
No, not the commoners actually. Wouldn't they
most
spend about
people.
90% of their money on food in the hyperinflation period?
When situations got worse, yes.
Yeah.
So when the situation was not that bad,
I think
the
it was
the
about.
commons would most of the commoners would spend about half of their money on food and the other half on other things. But when situations got worse, this is because of a very uh, cold winter and drought that come about because of that, and and also France funding the American Revolution and a few other factors, they actually did not have a lot of money. and the treasury was running out of money. And poor people, the commons, they had to spend about 90% of their income on food, and that's not sustainable. And when the king called for the Estates General, the whole purpose of the Estates General, which was called after 175 years, so the king gets to decide when they want to call and they don't want to call the Estates General. So he called for the Estates General because he wanted to tax the public more so that the treasury can be filled. And and it's a no-brainer. And because the nobility and the clergy don't pay a lot of tax, they are actually comfortable with that, but the poor people are not. And that's where the French Revolution sort of started.
Right. And this is very interesting because normally the understanding is, or what you would normally read, is that there were certain central figures who um, propagated certain philosophies, and that led to a turn from these old order of the monarchy and the divine right of the nobility to general common right to decide how you want to be governed. So the fact is that so many weather situations actually led to a loss of production of food, which led to hyperinflation, which means that the common man could not have his bread and butter, literally. And they did not even have the mechanism to reduce taxes or make their lives more comfortable. And it was those dire straits that led to this situation.
Yes. Usually, most civilizational changes happen because of, like, it's culmination of a lot of things that happens at the same time.
Thank you, Pankaj, for explaining what Estates General is, what the three estates were, and how the French Revolution began. Um, so, what we understand is that this very, very significant event is where the terms left and right wing originated. And those terms are in use today. And the meanings of those terms have evolved over time. But essentially, they started a significant event in history, one of the biggest revolutions, where monarchy ended and then the people's rule began. So that's very interesting. And thank you for watching us today. We will be back with another attempt to understand the chaos around us. Please like, share, and subscribe, and leave some
Thank you.
comments. Thank you.
Thank you.